Brilliant. Hello, everybody. I'm Kalypso Nicolaidis, speaking to you from Oxford, quote unquote, on behalf of our European Union program, political economy program. And indeed, today we are very excited to welcome three wonderful speakers on a topic that is close to all of our hearts. How do we get to a clean energy world? And within that world, how do we get to a clean energy EU? Whether or not we want to conceive it as a model for the rest of the world, or at least opening the way in various ways or experimenting. And today we are going to talk about one of the most exciting, I believe, kind of innovation, which is this idea of local energy communities. Increasingly, you hear on the radio or newspaper, get your energy in a different way. What does that mean? So we will discuss that, and we will discuss the way in which the EU has endorsed and sought to promote this idea of local energy communities. And what does that really mean? I mean, do we buy it, basically? And is the EU a forerunner, or is it just following a kind of a trend? So today we're going to have three speakers who are going to introduce the topic, what energy communities means, and kind of look at this triangle of actors: governments, civil society, and the energy industry, generally speaking, in terms of both rights and industry and disruptive potential. So just to discuss this topic, to really ask what's at stake, and where's the promise, and where might we be critical? We will first have Jake and Jenny. Jake Barnes, who is professor here at Oxford at the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics and at the Environmental Change Institute. We all know that Oxford has an amazing ecosystem of research on this issue, and he's worked from various politics and sociological perspective on these issues for a very long time. So it's really exciting to hear you, Jake. And he will be speaking with Jenny, with whom he's doing this research, Jenny Palm, who is professor in sustainable urban governance for transition to low carbon and resource efficient economies, and who works indeed on, has been also working on all these topics, including with the IIIE, and the Swedish Energy Agency, etc. You have their bios in the chat, so I'm not going to expand. Only to say that Jenny's still working on her camera, but as we were just saying, she has this most lovely picture with an energy converter. She might explain herself. So even if Jenny's camera don't work, we'll be fine and happy. And then as both a discussant, but also to add another dimension is Kristian Petrick, who as a freelance consultant right now has been working also on the Horizon 2020 project PROSEU, so very closely working with the Commission, with the EU institutions, and also has a past with the industry, including Siemens. So it'll be very interesting to hear Kristian's perspective, as well as his preliminary comments on Jake and Jenny's presentation. So without further ado, let me now give the floor to Jake. And Jake, you're going to share your slides, right? So welcome to St. Antony's European Study Center.
Hello all, and thanks for the warm introduction. Hopefully you can see my slides now. I should point out that you've inadvertently given me a promotion. I'm not a professor. I'm not sure where that came from. It's probably more appropriate to describe me as an early career researcher. But if you wanted to give me a promotion, that's great. I'll gratefully receive it. Yeah, I guess.
If you take immediately.
It's easily done. I think there might have been a mix-up there. The rest of the bio was pretty spot on. I think it's worth saying thank you to the audience as well for coming along this evening. It is late in the day. It's also the beginning of the great unlocking in the UK, is how I heard it on the radio this morning. So that means that you've chosen to sit in and listen to us talk about energy communities, whereas you could have been sitting in a pub for the first time in months, inside a pub or inside a restaurant, or I think even hugging your neighbour, if that's what you want to be doing and you've missed out on in the last few months. So thank you for being here. And thanks also to Daniel Hardy for the invitation. My initial discussions with him about the content of this talk was pretty much as Kalypso says. So wanting to discuss whether energy communities are a kind of disruptive innovation for the European energy system, or whether it's going to be a bit more of the same or slightly different. So that's where I hope we get to with this conversation this evening. But of course, when exploring and talking about this area, we first have to cover some basics. So tonight, if I can, oh, there we go. We're first going to cover the basics of the EU's clean energy package and energy communities within it. And then, of course, the more basic area of what are energy communities and where have they come from. So that's the first part of mine and Jenny's talk. We'll then follow that up with some country experiences of energy communities and their challenges or progress in transposing the clean energy package into national laws and regulations. And we'll follow that up very quickly with 4 critical issues that we've identified or we recognise in taking forward energy communities. So that's the content of our talk. It's all informed by the Newcomers project, which both Jenny and I currently work on. Newcomers being the kind of broad project name of the New Clean Energy Communities in the Changing European Energy System project, which is funded by Horizon 2020. In that, Jenny works on the national settings for energy communities, and myself with my colleagues Paula Hansen and Sarah Darby are taking a kind of more in-depth dive into case studies of energy communities spread across 6 European countries. Those countries you can see on the map on the screen there. So we've got the UK and Sweden, which we'll be looking at a little bit more closely tonight. Then there's also the Netherlands, Germany, Slovenia, and Italy. I think that's probably all I wanted to say as by way of an introduction. So now I'll hand over to Jenny, who's going to introduce us to the EU's clean energy package and what it says about energy communities.
Yes, thank you, Jake. And I'm so sorry that I cannot have my camera function as I want to. But yes, you at least have me at a picture there where I am standing at the heat exchanger at our institute and showing that for some audience. But I will try to get this camera working, so I hope that it will be better. So yes, we will say some, or I will talk a little bit about this European Clean Energy for All Europeans package, the Clean Energy package that we call it, that we have looked into, and I think that it is good in many ways. I will give you some perspective on it from perhaps a Swedish point of view, because I'm working in Sweden at Lund University. But I think that starting with this clean energy package, it is a quite comprehensive update of the energy policy framework, where the aim is to facilitate the transition away from our fossil dependency that we have within the European Union. And it's also a way to try to achieve the goals that we had agreed upon in the Paris Agreement, and to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. And what we have is that the clean energy package consists of 8 legislative acts, where we have 4 directives that is more of targets, and 4 regulations that are more binding. And we will mostly discuss 2 of those directives, and that is the Renewable Energy Directive, and it is also the Internal Electricity Market Directive, both in red here, because that is the 2 directives that is dealing with energy communities that we are researching on. So I think we'll leave them and move on, Jake, to the next. What I think, if you're starting with this Renewable Energy Directive, I think the good part with that, and I think that it's quite ambitious, and I think they have many benefits coming with this. And I really like that they are emphasizing this with creating an enabling framework, and that they want the EU or the administration around energy communities and to create local energy initiative to become more easy. So if looking into this directive, they are saying that the member states should carry out, they will assess existing barriers, because as we know from research, there are a lot of barriers out there. When people want to start or initiate different energy projects, there are many barriers that hinder them. So this directive says that yes, but each member state needs to start assessing those existing barriers. And then they should also provide this enabling frameworks that is, the aim is to promote and facilitate the development of energy communities. So I think it's very clear, and I really appreciate this take that the clean energy package has on this, because the idea is to remove those regulatory and administrative barriers that we have identified for many years now, and also look into how we could find a process, an administrative process that is transparent for the citizens and that is inclusive and that can in a way facilitate them to start up those new initiatives that energy communities are part of. And it also states that the DSOs in most European countries, we have a monopoly on the grid side of the system. And in this directive, it says that this distribution system operators should cooperate with energy communities to facilitate an exchange of produced electricity, locally produced electricity. So I think those parts are good. So we can move on, Jake. And what they also are dealing with in this is that also has been criticized for many years now, that is that we have a lack of support schemes targeting energy communities specifically. And this Renewable Energy Directive says that the member states should ensure that energy communities can take part of the support schemes that are out there. But they also state, and this I think is important, that energy community should not be a way to get around costs and taxes that we have. So you cannot have an energy community as a kind of cherry picking where you avoid, for example, contributing to the electricity grid that we need to invest in as all citizens. So I think it's nice also this aspects of it. Yes, we can take the next. So what we deal with in this clean energy package is that we have 2 forms of energy communities that are discussed, and why we can discuss that perhaps later, but why they have divided it into 2 different kinds of energy communities is not really clear for me, at least. And I'm not so sure that this is only positive, but we have the renewable energy communities and we have citizens energy communities, and they share many characteristics in this clean energy package. But there are also differences there. So for example, for citizen energy communities, there are no geographic limitations. So anyone, anywhere can participate. And for the renewable energy communities, it says that member states may provide for open, for cross-border participation. But for example, in Sweden, the authority has suggested that this would not be a possibility. So this will only be a Swedish renewable energy community. So that can differ in the future. And they also said for the renewable energy community, the emphasis that the effective control of this community should be limited to the member living close to this energy project. In both cases, the membership should be open and voluntary, so it would be free for anyone to join, but also to exit the community when they want to. So it will not be, and this has consequences. For example, if an energy community wants to become a DSO, that can create problems if you cannot leave them because it's a monopoly. But that's at least the same for both of these. When it comes to renewable energy communities, large enterprises are not allowed to be members, but when it comes to citizen energy communities, they are. So any actor can participate there as long as those big or medium-sized and large enterprises don't exercise any control of it. So it still should be a citizens-controlled community, meaning that the citizens are going to have the majority of the decision power in this. A renewable energy community can deal with renewable energy sources at both electricity and the heat market. A citizen energy community can just be an actor at the electricity market. And I think that the main differences between those, if reading those, is that the purpose with the renewable energy community is that they want to, this will be a tool to get away from a fossil fuel dependency and increase renewables on the market. While the citizen energy communities, there they are more emphasizing that they want new actors on the markets that is non-commercial energy market actors. So that I would say is the main differences between those. We can change again. Yeah, now it's you, Jake.
Okay, so as Joni sets out, the clean energy package is high-level legislation from the EU, and to re-emphasize, and particularly for me, I see it as setting out the rights and in the future the responsibilities of individuals and communities to generate, store and sell, distribute electricity in the future. But that's all quite abstract. Jenny set out the differences between the two different types, which are legislated for in the directives. But it raises the question, what are energy communities in practice, and where have they come from? So that's what I'm hoping to unpack now. So the way that we think about them in the project, and I think this is probably the easiest way to conceptualize of energy communities, is to think about two overlapping spheres of activity. So the two overlapping spheres, and where they meet is what we can provisionally call energy communities. On the left-hand side, we've got fairly traditional, long-standing community action on energy. It's certainly not new. It's got a very long history across Europe, but it is a niche activity when we think about energy systems as a whole. So historical examples might include the Danish wind cooperatives from the 1970s, or Austrian solar thermal self-build movements from the 1980s. And what links these two examples are kind of the grassroots tinkering, innovation with technologies and pushing forward with alternatives, which were then later taken up by mainstream commercial actors. So yes, it's not new, but it's premised on bottom-up grassroots activity and the involvement of individuals, often working in a kind of a citizenship manner, doing it for the greater good. So it's an incredibly diverse field of activity. It's diverse in terms of the activities pursued and the organizations involved, but also the motivations. You know, whether you're doing it for carbon savings or for social cohesion or to keep money in the local community or area. On top of that, we also have the kind of commonality that it typically tries to address local issues. But within this kind of broad sphere of activity, which does encompass a lot, we can think of kind of eco open home days, where you try and encourage your neighbour to take up insulation measures, through to car sharing initiatives. If all of these are kind of examples of activity within community action on energy, there are some which are developing more business-like models, and that's also being pushed by policy, and that pushes them towards the local energy sphere. So the image we can see in the top left, that's of Westmill Solar Cooperative, which was and probably still is one of the largest renewable energy cooperatives in England. It was set up in 2014, 2015, group of people coming together to collectively finance and then install and manage PV systems in this sense, in this case. And power generated is fed into the grid and bought through a power purchase agreement by a licensed supplier. And participating members receive a return on their investments. So this would be an example of a renewable energy community, or it could be an example of renewable energy community under the clean energy package if everyone involved were local to that installation, which I think there are a high proportion that probably are in this case, and some which come from further afield. So that's kind of one half of the sphere. The other half is what we can broadly term emerging local energy systems activities. It's relatively new, but it's mainstream in the sense that it involves mainstream incumbent actors and also startups and spin-off companies. The motivations here are kind of distinctly different from community action in that typically it's profit-oriented. It's normally more broadly focused on economic growth and job creation. It thinks about the role of people in local energy systems as active consumers rather than citizens. So seeking to create more customer-centered solutions to the delivery of energy. And that positions it in the realm of creating a smarter, more decentralized, flexible energy systems. And it can broadly be seen as a response of incumbent energy companies or the incumbent marketplace, recognizing the fact that its traditional business model is under threat. There are declining opportunities, or severely under threat, and so they're having to look for new value propositions. And so that's where this kind of local energy sphere comes from, and it's pushing towards more localized smart solutions, and that's where it begins to overlap with the kind of community energy sphere, sort of stepping on the toes. And the final thing I was going to emphasize in this is that both spheres, whether it's community action on energy, which has kind of been pushed to be more commercially oriented and professional in outlook, or whether it's local energy that's emerging as a potential value or place where value can be created from incumbent businesses, they're both being shaped by broader kind of trends within the energy system. We all know them very well, the kind of push for decarbonisation, whether that's politically motivated targets or support policies for renewables. We've got decentralisation, pushing away from the centralised control and management of generation plants towards the grid's edge, or digitalisation, opening up new ways to manage, control energy systems, but also on the other hand, opening up new ways to connect people. So I think the only thing I haven't mentioned there is the picture on the right. So that comes from Siemens, and it's a kind of visualization of a future smart local energy system, which is digitally connected and managed at the local scale. I think we could also hypothecate that it's more flexible if we think that there's a battery in there somewhere. But it gives you an idea of the kind of system or local system that we might be looking at in the future. Okay, that's my introduction of energy communities, what they might mean. Now we're going to move on to the second half of the talk, which is about country experiences. So what does the clean energy package and what mean for two countries, Sweden and the UK? What's the history of energy communities in these two countries? And here we're hoping to pick up on the kind of more contextual, cultural, technological, political issues that might shape the development of energy communities moving forwards. So over to you, Jenny.
Yes, I will say some words about energy communities in Sweden. In Sweden, we have less of an experience of community energy. We of course have in our in our Newcomers project, we have, for example, Dalby Solar Village as an example, but it's not that many for the moment. I think they are one of 9 solar communities in Sweden. And then we also have experience from wind cooperatives that we have since the 90s, where you can buy wind shares as a citizen. But I would say that in the past we have had limited experience because we also have a limited need for local energy solutions in Sweden. And the reason for that is, as Jake was talking about, that more about an institutional and cultural context that we are in Sweden. We have come quite far when it comes to going away from fossil fuels in Sweden. I will show you how the system looks like on the next slide. But we have quite much renewables already in the system in Sweden. And also we have for 100 years has a history of public ownerships when it comes to the energy systems, both the heating system and the electricity system. So we have a history of state-owned electricity companies, electricity production, and municipal-owned energy companies that both produced heat and electricity in their plants, but also owns the grid. So the Swedish market is usually explained like we have a few large power companies that produce electricity, and then we have some, or we have municipal-owned companies as DSOs. So I would say that in a way the Swedish people have for long owned the energy system. So there have been less of a need to start up local citizen initiatives because we have owned it as citizens. So we have had our representatives running the show for us, so to say. So today when we are talking about energy communities in Sweden, it's not that many people that know so much about this, I would say. And the word energigemenskap in Swedish is quite unknown. It's the researcher and some early adopters that can discuss this in Swedish. And I think that most Swedes would say that those local initiatives, like those energy communities, are less urgent in a Swedish perspective. And we can look at the system on the next slide. So as you see, we have, and we have had for long, we have hydropower in the bottom, and then we have nuclear power. So I think that this debate on fossil fuel dependency that are in many other member states in Europe are not really here in Sweden, because we are quite satisfied, even if we have nuclear, I would say. That it's not so much of a discussion, that it's an urgent need to find alternatives to oil or coal or whatever it is. But if you're looking, yes, at the future in Sweden, as it looks like right now, the actors that mostly are discussing energy communities are actually the big energy companies, like I'm working with E.ON here in Sweden, because they are interested in starting up energy communities. And then we, of course, are talking about more citizen energy communities, because they cannot start renewable energy communities, as I said. But I think that they are very interesting to find a way how to cooperate with citizens in Sweden to start up different projects. So we are looking into one here in Malmö, for example. But if you're looking into this clean energy package, it is not transposed into Swedish law yet, and it's nothing unique for Sweden, because that's most of the European countries has not transposed it yet. The Swedish government has said that it will be stepwise transposition, so we will see when it will happen. We don't have a clear timeline. But what the Energy Market Inspectorate has done, it's our control authority, is that they have proposed a new law that covers both citizen energy communities and renewable energy communities. So what they are saying is, for example, that energy community must be included in the name of the future energy community. So if you are a wind cooperative today and wants to have the benefits coming with being an energy community, you need to change your name so that it says energy community. It will not be allowed to be a limited company, for example. So every energy community needs to have the form of an economic association. And the reason for that is that the Energy Market Inspectorate means that it's in line with the clean energy package. Wish to have this as simple as possible for the citizens, and economic associations in Sweden are a simple association form. And energy communities in Sweden will not be allowed to own a grid, and that is of the same reason, because the Energy Market Inspector thinks it's very complicated to own a distribution grid today. So they recommend that the energy community will not be allowed to do that. But still, we will see. But it's most likely that these regulations will come through in the future, but when we don't really know yet.
Okay, so quick overview of what's happening here in the UK. I'm conscious of time, so yeah, I'll make this one quick. We have a long history of bottom-up action on energy by communities, but it's safe to say that that's largely been peripheral to mainstream activity. And we can see that in the way that policy has, over the years, encouraged community action. Particularly during the early 2000s, it was often very instrumental. Community enthusiasm was seen as a way to get support for renewables, so combating NIMBYism in effect. It probably reached its height in the early 2010s with the launch of the Community Energy Strategy, which set out a clear target and goals for community-owned renewables to be achieved by 2020. But since then, it's flagged a little bit. Concurrent to the strategy was the introduction of the feed-in tariff, and that resulted in an explosion of collective generation projects. So the Westmill solar co-ops that I mentioned earlier. And it was, community action was largely a byproduct of the fact that there were safe, easy ways to set up a renewables project with a guaranteed return. And community action benefited from that. But as as many of you will know, the feed-in tariffs were continually refined to save money for the average consumer. And this meant that community projects had to become increasingly professionalized, and their projects had to become more commercial in orientation in order to survive. So as the feed-in tariffs reduced over time, community projects tended to get bigger to compensate for the drop in revenue. And they, instead of just receiving a return through the feed-in tariff, they often had to start selling their electricity to prospective buyers in order to get a higher return. And so that meant more negotiation of contracts and professionalization of activity, and a stronger focus on business models. And that's led now to a position in 2021 in which the feed-in tariffs have been withdrawn, and there's now a frantic search for viable community business models without a feed-in tariff. There are a few potential possibilities, but they all rely on sort of favourable conditions. So a good site for generation next to a large energy user for a direct kind of power purchase scheme. But the more creative stuff is implying partnering with other organisations and actors to do more innovative stuff. At the same time, the future prospect, since 2015, there's been a shift in government focus away from community towards local energy. And local energy has this kind of ambiguous role for community participation. It's not clear quite what the community sector or actors might bring to local energy. And that in part is because it's emphasizing more economic growth, jobs, and replicability across solutions. And it views customers, well, people as customers, as opposed to participating citizens with kind of rights and responsibilities. In terms of the transposition of the clean energy package, that's murky, to say the least. It's sort of complicated and very unclear because of our rupture with the European continent. In essence, the UK was released from transposing the Renewable Energy Directive and other directives under the Clean Energy Package. But the trade and cooperation agreement that was agreed just before Christmas does provide for some alignments with existing and future EU policies, so meeting agreed EU targets. But it's, as far as I can see, quite unclear what the detail of some of these directives mean for UK policy. How closely is the UK going to align to it? But one interesting aspect of the UK situation is that in the last year there was a local electricity bill. It was proposed as an idea and supported by nearly 300 members of parliament. But in essence, it shares the same kind of core logic and focus on rights as the Clean Energy Package does. And so the local electricity bill is premised on the idea that local generators have the right to supply local people. And like the Clean Energy Package of the European Union, it's a little bit ambiguous as to how that would actually be achieved. Now, there's very little hope of this bill being passed through the Commons, but it does set a direction of travel, which is similar to that of the European Union. So to wrap up, we just wanted to highlight 4 key issues that we think will probably shape how energy communities are taken forward. Now, the first one, transposition. I don't think Jenny's actually mentioned it, but the Renewable Energy Directive has to be transposed by member states by the end of June this year. And the Energy Market Directive should have been transposed by member states by the end of December last year. So we're at a pivotal point in the implementation of the clean energy package. And there's a lot of pressure at the moment on member states to do a good job in its transition. How do you transpose it into national rules and regulations? Now, clearly that matters, but the thing I think we want to highlight here is that because the clean energy package is quite high level, it talks about rights and it has some detail, but it leaves a lot open to interpretation. The transposition matters, but it also matters because it sets out a direction of travel. So rather than viewing transposition as a single one-off thing that has to be completed by a particular date, the extent to which energy communities get taken up depend to a large part on whether the clean energy package is viewed as something that needs to be continually revisited as energy policy evolves. Now, that becomes a little bit clearer when we think about the expected changes that we might see in the energy system, whether that's around support for renewables or the development of capacity markets, or even the development of national and local flexibility markets. How might energy communities that in both forms engage with these areas? It needs to be considered as these policies are being developed. The second area is around partnerships. I hinted at this previously, but our work is indicating that beyond the simple collective generation projects, where everyone pitches in and helps to fund a solar panel or a wind turbine that feeds electricity to the grids, beyond those what could be called simpler business models, the newer innovative ideas are involving various partnerships, the most common of which is partnering with a licensed supplier. And in many respects, that's because there are a variety of responsibilities that commercial organizations and suppliers in particular have around managing relationships and the ability of customers to opt out that are very complex. And it might, well, it certainly is the case at the moment that national rules and legislations mean that it's beyond the remit of energy communities to do. But even if legislation is to change, it's likely that some functions and responsibilities of organisations which provide services within the energy market are going to be beyond the remit of bottom-up collective activity. So there's a question to what extent will national policy support the development of novel partnerships between different actors? And at the moment, it's a bit unclear. In the UK, certainly the emphasis is on private business. Then we have societal visions. And principally, this is about the way in which national policy views people within energy systems. I think there's a really interesting, not confrontation, but debate to be had around people being framed as citizens with rights and responsibilities towards the energy system, or as purely consumers of novel energy tariffs or value propositions. So the way in which policies are developed at the national level and their kind of thoughts on developing an active citizenry or an active engaged consumers is really quite important. And then the final issue is perhaps more of a reflection, is that we're in a period of huge turmoil within energy systems. And although we've got some idea about what the future will bring, it's likely to be more decarbonised, we hope. It's likely to be more decentralised. It's likely to be more digitalised. It may be more democratic. We really don't know what the business models are going to look like. And so there's going to be an incredible amount of flux or churn within energy systems at the European level moving forwards. And that makes it really quite hard to see a path for energy communities moving forward, or what that path might look like. I think we shall leave it there, if that's all right, Jenny. And back to Kalypso.
Thank you so much, Jake and Jenny, and wonderful to have you back visually, Jenny. And indeed, you raised so many important points, including this last question on citizens versus consumers or customers, which is so important, and which kind of also brings us back to this semi-Orwellian, distinction really in this story between communities and citizens. But whereby citizens really mean corporations, as far as I can tell. So there's a lot of semantics that we need to wrap our heads around coming from the EU, but also some hardcore questions that your presentation raised around national and local autonomy that we can see both within your cases, but also across UK and Sweden. Where unsurprisingly, different countries with different stories and tradition do things differently. But if you add Brexit on to the story, then we have a kind of real scale, almost case study of experimentation in different contexts. And really, what difference does the EU make? If the UK can kind of do it without the EU, what difference does the EU make? So in order to kind of give us a bit more of that EU viewpoint, Kristian, the floor is yours, both to comment on what we just heard and to add your take from PROSEU viewpoint. And let me just also add that there are already a couple of questions in the Q&A, which I'll read in a minute. I hope others can also jump in, and including Adrian, our great in-house specialist on these issues, but of course also Daniel Hardy is the one really behind this whole event, and I'm looking forward, Daniel, to putting your questions in a moment. So Kristian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kalypso, and thank you very much, everybody, for having me on this webinar. My name is Kristian Petrick. I work, among others, for EcoUnion as a consultant for renewable energy, and I will present the outcomes of a project that is called PROSEU, that Horizon 2020 project that just finished in February. And I will try also to, in this presentation, give some responses basically to what we have heard from Jake and Jenny, or comments maybe. So this is just an overview of the project that we were in 11 partners, in this case from 9 countries, finished in February, and the focus was on mainstreaming active participation of citizens in the energy transition. So we understood here citizens as both individuals as well as energy communities. As we have heard, there are different directives in the energy package, and the most important ones are the Renewable Energy Directive and the Market Directive. Is this different definitions of energy communities, and also they have the renewable self-consumer and the active consumer. Jenny wasn't sure why there are 2 directives or 2 definitions rather on energy communities. That was an issue of different working groups in the European Commission working on these different directives. So it's basically just different people working on that in parallel, and people try to understand what's going on in which stream, which were led by different people. And in the end, it was not fully consistent, but more or less. But indeed, it adds additional complexity to the whole issue of energy communities, which may have been avoided if that was even more important on the agenda. But what is important is also mentioned by Jake and Jenny. We have now, as citizens, the right to generate, self-consume, store, and sell renewable energy, and to participate in energy communities. And this is really fundamental. This is really something new for us. So we should take this right, and we can ask this right from our governments. So as Jenny said, indeed, the renewable or the clean energy package is quite good with regards to now renewables and energy communities. The European or the EU basically has done their homework. We can be quite happy with that. But now it's upon the member states to implement that, or to transpose and implement that. And this is basically the last slide of Jake, who mentioned now transposition is an important part. And what we have done now here in PROSEU is to provide policy advice on how to transpose. So I will focus a little bit on that, but with this vision in mind, having prosumers and energy communities as the center of the future European Energy Union, or Europe, or so we have, instead of being the utilities, basically everything about the large utilities and then the other actors around, and maybe there's a small part of prosumers and energy communities. In future, we think, and that's also what the Clean Energy Package states, that prosumers and energy communities should be in the center of the Energy Union. So the principles that I briefly go through, there are 5: setting ambitious targets, ensuring economic viability, fostering renewable energy communities, establishing energy responsibility and coherence at all levels, and ensuring prosumer representation and governance. So I quickly run through that. First one, targets. To acknowledge, or targets are actually important to acknowledge that prosumers and energy communities have the right to be there. And only if you put up targets, then you can really show that you are, that you really want to get there. So we propose, on the one hand, rooftop PV targets, because rooftop PV has the advantage that basically always, in almost all circumstances, the ones that live below the roof or that on the building have to be involved. So automatically you have, with rooftop PV, some kind of citizen involvement. And the other one is having a target for energy communities. So how much should energy communities, how many should exist maybe, or how many gigawatts should they install, or how many people should participate in that. So for that, also countries should put up targets. As you can see, these are overlapping because rooftop PV could also be done by energy communities. But in general, we think it's important to have those. Just briefly on the EU rooftop targets, that should be focusing or based on the potentials. And if you just say by 2030, maybe 50% capacity target, that would be 340 gigawatts by 2040, according to JRC. But there are also other studies out there that even show higher potential of rooftop PV. But yeah, quite an important part of energy in the future can come from rooftop PV and thus from citizen energy, basically. Economic viability, that was mentioned by Jake, that now there's a frantic search for viable business models because there are no feed-in tariffs anymore. Indeed, that's a big issue, that feed-in tariffs have been reduced too much, or that they have been taken out completely, like in the UK. That's why we call, maybe not for feed-in tariffs, but a surplus power tariff. So there should be a reasonable remuneration for excess energy to make it easy to sell this to the grid and to have a decent payback time, time for the energy produced. Or at least, or another way would be to allow and make it easy to self-consume, a joint self-consumption beyond the building, and then make it easy to share energy. There are examples for that in some countries, but still most member states are far behind that. Conducive rate design means that you focus rather, that the rate should rather be based on kilowatt hours, so that you can save energy by self-consuming, than on high access or connection rates. Yeah, simple taxation, unconditional priority grid access, these are other points that ensure economic viability. Then fostering renewable energy communities, there should be national forms well defined, and this is where the transposition is really behind in most of the countries. Some countries have just translated one by one the provisions of the directives, but not providing further ideas on how to remove administrative, technical, and financial legal barriers, as mentioned by Jenny. There is member states should look also into how to get support or how to support the participation of the energy poor, and in general do much more on education on energy issues and improving energy literacy among the population, because people have to better understand what energy actually means. Energy responsibility and Koreans at all levels means that it's not energy in future is not something that you just the government is doing and then everything should work, but it becomes part of all levels, on the private personal level and of the community, of the municipality, and then on the region and the country. And so it's a bottom-up approach, and all have to put parts into that, because otherwise we just won't reach the Paris Agreement goals. That means there should be 100% renewable energy plans on all levels, and trying to get as much renewable energy on all levels into the system, making it also coherent with other frameworks like the industrial fiscal policies. Which kind of industry do you actually want to promote? How do you deal with social affairs, improving the educational system, as I mentioned, and so on. And then finally, ensuring prosumer participation in the governance processes. This is where we think that during the transposition, but also the implementation, representatives of energy communities should be asked for their input, and or not only energy communities, but also the citizens. And actively seeking this input is usually done through public consultation processes. So last year, in the beginning of last year, we proposed for the transposition deadlines of the Electricity Market Directive, which was end of last year, and the Renewable Energy Directive, which was by end of June, to have actually 2 consultations, first on the early draft and then on the final draft before it's being finalized. And what we have seen is that basically no country has done any consultations, not even one. And if so, then only on the final draft, which is usually too late. In general, they are all too late. I think there's no country that has well transposed these 2 directives with regards to energy communities or prosumers well. So it will still take some time until all are through, but we have already the impression that the citizens are not sufficiently asked to give their input on that, which is a pity. Again, member states are, or the governments are in charge here. We provided through our project also a detailed transposition guidance document, which you can find on our website. And since the question of this webinar was, is that something which is an ongoing, energy communities, is that an ongoing challenge? And yes, we think so. You see, this is a slide that is used by Rescope EU, the association of hundreds of energy communities in Europe, where you see the old playing field, just the authorities and the commercial market players and citizens just sitting and watching. We will have basically a new game where communities with the citizens are a new player in there, and it's in a new playing field with the authorities and other commercial market players. And we have to develop these new rules. So as Jake said, we have to review these things. We have to see how it goes. We don't know how the end game, well, end game is a bad term maybe, but how it finally will look like in the end. But there is a good basis for that, and we should not allow governments to just postpone this whole process of fostering energy communities and lower barriers because they say, well, we have time and we don't actually know where it's going, and just let's see what happens. This shouldn't be the case. So it has to be an active support for energy communities and citizens to make this new energy level playing field happen. And with that, I close, and I'm happy to also I'm looking forward to the discussion and to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristian. And we had discussed giving Jenny and Jake the opportunity to react to your presentation, but if it's okay with Jenny and Jake, I'll take the liberty to ask you to kind of wrap your reaction to Kristian while also addressing some of the questions, because we're kind of a bit behind schedule. And I mean, I think we have kind of, for the moment, 3 categories of questions. There's from, I guess, Adrian, Chasty, and Charles, like the big question about the premise of it all, where Adrian is asking, given economies of scale, you know, you'd want maybe one grid for the European level. So could you, why in the first case is there a need for local and smaller scale communities versus improving the eco and social orientation of national energy supplier? And of course, Jenny was speaking to that point in the Swedish case. And we could also say, you know, pan-European ones. So there's this question of scale and the efficiency of scale. And actually, Charles has a kind of variant on this question about matching, Charles Enoch, on matching local involvements with pan-EU demand. So it's the same, you know, another way of formulating very similar question, stemming from again, from Jenny's point about Sweden. And contribute, and he gives the example of hydropower. And also at the kind of this kind of level of the premises, we have Daniel's question on would and should energy communities play a role in deciding who might get to use what in terms of the scarce energy of the renewable electricity as demand increases. So what kind of power, regulatory power, these citizens and communities should have, could have? And we might put that with the structural questions of Charles and Adrian. There are other questions that I want to come back to, but can we kind of take the round on these big structural questions? And this time I might start with Jenny, because Jenny, you know, we're bouncing off a lot on your Sweden analysis.
Yes, yes, and I do agree with the comments, and we have a discussion on this in Sweden also, that what is the benefit with energy communities? It is really a good question, especially when we have been so focused, or at least the European Union has been so focused on that it will be a tool to decrease the fossil dependency. And Sweden is saying, yeah, but we are not fossil dependent. But as I see it, and that's why I think the citizen energy communities are interesting to think about, because they are more emphasizing that we need new actors into the market. Because what is happening in Sweden, because we have this public ownership, of course, but we don't have active citizens. And what I think that energy communities can bring in is activity on a citizen level, because when today when we are discussing energy issues and how to develop, for example, the smart grid or whatever issue we want to discuss, the citizens are not there really, I would say. And Kristian was talking about the Århus Convention, and we are discussing that a lot in Sweden, because we don't even have a consumer organization that can represent the consumers today. And I think that relating to a bigger issue about energy literacy and how prepared the citizens are to actually discuss how we want to have the energy market in the future, then we are not really there. So I think that the benefits for Sweden are not perhaps the renewables or those technical aspects, but other aspects like knowledge and awareness and those kinds of things. I think it's so important with the clean energy package and the energy communities, but perhaps on other levels than this technology and the energy sources.
I mean, just to piggyback on this, because the question from Daniel, there's another I want to come back to, but Daniel really asked right on this, you know, Daniel Hardy, on what the prosumer projects meant a lot to ordinary citizens who have other things on their mind, probably, given the precariousness of our societies. This is me adding. So what kind of incentives will citizens have? I mean, Jenny, you just spelled out the fact that that's part of the goal. There might even be a trade-off in terms of economies of scale, but let citizens kind of own their destiny. But Daniel is pushing back about free riding and incentives, and are we not expecting too much of citizens? I don't know, Jenny, if you want to bounce off this, or maybe Jake or Kristian want to address that. as well as the broader structural questions. So Kristian.
Well, I think the incentive, that's what I said, no one will do it if you lose money and if it's getting too complicated or if it's just too complicated. It has to be simple. It has to be something that where you, if you invest in your own PV panels or in energy community, that you have a reasonable payback time, or that, yeah, at least you don't lose money. That's why it's so important, this financial framework, and to remove any barriers that there are. Imagine just, I got now last year panels on my roof. Fortunately, I could do this together with a joint purchasing program of our energy cooperative here in Spain. So for me, it was not that complicated. But there are a lot of licenses and paperwork that you have to go through just for 3 kilowatt. And on the other hand, you can go into a shop and buy a 3 kilowatt heater, plug it in, and that's it. You know, and this kind of difference of just producing and consuming is so there's a huge gap which is not fully necessary. On the other topic, which was mentioned before, why do we need this local energy, is because only through that we get acceptance to the energy transition. Also